What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to CellMed, and today we have episode number
6.
of the MedViews series, where we'll be speaking with student Dr. Brian Kistler, who is a first-year medical student at the University of Toledo. So as always, just a quick rundown of the biography of our guest today. Brian Kistler is a first-year medical student at the University of Toledo College of Medicine. He is from outside of Sandusky, Ohio, and he attended John Carroll University, where he obtained a degree in chemistry with a minor in biology. During his time at John Carroll, he spent 2 years in an organic chemistry research lab studying relative carbon-cation stability and alkene reactions. He also spent the summer of 2019 working in a new lab at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner Research Institute's neuroimmunology department studying the gatekeeping function of meetings with immune cells. He also spent that summer doing a week-and-a-half-long mission trip in rural Honduras to provide basic medical care. This has helped fuel his desire to continue mission trips as a physician in the future. He has an interest in emergency medicine, primary care, but is only in his second semester of his first year of medical school and is waiting to experience more in the coming years. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and hop right into the interview. Hey, Brian, thanks for being on the channel. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. Is there anything in your bio that I mentioned that you want to go over, or anything that I may have missed?
No, I think that's basically everything.
Okay, so usually the first question, if you may know, that I always start off with is, why did you choose the field of medicine?
Yeah, so I've always had like a really profound love for science, and I grew up, my mom is an infection prevention nurse, so like our table talks as a kid were always about like different infections and bacteria and stuff like that. So that always kind of pointed me towards a field in medicine. And then in high school, I actually broke my back playing soccer. And so like going through that healing process definitely kind of led me towards medicine even further. And it kind of cemented it for me when I broke it a second time. And so I went through that healing process twice and had like an amazing surgeon the second time who was like insanely passionate about everything he did. And that was kind of the final straw for me to realize that I had the love for it. I had the ability to study for it. And that kind of made me realize that I wanted to be able to be that person for somebody in the future.
Okay, great answer. So you attend the University of Toledo, as you mentioned in your bio. How did that interview process look and work, and what did you do to prepare, and what did interview day look like?
Yeah, so for the University of Toledo, theirs is the MMI style of interview, the multiple miniature interviews. So they describe it as like speed dating, which is basically you'll go into one of their classrooms or like hallways, and there will be like 10 different rooms with interviewers in each of them, and they'll have a little prompt on the door that you get like 30 seconds to read before you go in. And then you go in, and for like 5 minutes, you just discuss whatever the prompt is. So Toledo's were a lot more critical thinking and a lot less like cut out answers. There weren't any questions of like, how do you fit in with our mission statement or anything like that. One of the questions that stuck out to me was like, how should scientists determine what species should go extinct and what species shouldn't? And it was less of like what you answered and more of like how you thought of it. So Toledo's is definitely an interesting one compared to some of the others that I had, which were just like 20 minutes, sit down, they hold your resume and they go through every little piece of it. So for University of Toledo, I honestly didn't do much to prepare because it was kind of like nobody knows what questions they're going to ask. And it was a lot of just coming up with things off the top of your head.
So I saw that in your biography that I read that you were involved in a lot of research in undergrad. What other extracurriculars were you involved in? But if you could expand a bit more on like what research did for you and how it helped you get into medical school, but also if you were involved in any research or any other extracurriculars in medical school.
Yeah. So the main extracurricular that I was in at John Carroll was John Carroll EMS, which is our volunteer emergency medical services program. And so I was in that for 2 years, I think, and I was equipment manager for a year with that. And so basically I got EMS certified over the summer, and then for like 8 hours once a week, and then every third week we had like a 12-hour overnight shift. We would just be on call for anybody who would have any medical issues on campus, which at John Carroll, it was usually just like somebody spraining an ankle. But it was definitely like a very good way to get into patient interactions, different thought processes, like different differentials and stuff like that. We do a lot of practice interviews at University of Toledo, and there's a lot of people who have like clearly never had a patient interaction before. And so being in John Carroll EMS, like we went through every single thing that we do in our practice interviews. So like that was a huge step up to have that going into medical school. In terms of the research that I did, like I said in the bio, I did a 2-year research project in organic chemistry, which when I tell people that at medical school, they usually think that I'm crazy, but I looked at carbocation stability with alkene addition. And so it has basically no medical relevance at all. So that was just kind of a way to get my feet wet with research, kind of problem solve different things, especially when the pandemic hit, like figuring out how to do all of these experiments that I had to be in person for from a distance. Like it was a lot of problem solving and general principles that I could take into research in the future, but nothing really medically relevant. And then for my research at the clinic, it was a neuroimmunology lab. So he looked at how immune cells get into the brain and through the meninges, which is kind of a protective layer over the brain. And that was basic science research. It didn't really have any medical component to it. It wasn't like we were interviewing patients or anything like that or doing case controls, but it was a good way to kind of see how basic science is like the backbone for all medicine. Like we weren't applying anything to patients. We were doing everything on mouse models, but it was easy to see like how once this went through mouse models, it could apply to patients, and how all research has to start with a mouse model, kind of getting the fundamentals down, and then you can start to apply it to humans. So while I didn't do anything like medically relevant for my research, it was all really good experiences of like why research is so important. It also kind of showed me that like I don't want to spend my entire life researching, but I really appreciate the process.
Is there any interviews or any extracurriculars that you were involved in medical school?
So with COVID and distance learning and everything like that, extracurriculars are definitely like cut down a lot more. They're a lot harder, but the one that I'm in is students for medical missions. So they will do trips abroad, and they'll be hosting medical brigades, but at the moment they're kind of on pause. So what we do instead right now is we do a lot of food pantry drives and fundraising for potential future medical missions. So we've been doing a lot of food pantries for like the campus's food pantry and also some of the local ones in Toledo, because there's definitely a high prevalence of food insecurity and homelessness in the area in Toledo.
Yeah, I bet that's even more prevalent now with the pandemic. So it's great that you guys are taking the initiative. So what study strategies helped you in undergrad? And then what did you do to change those strategies in medical school if you made any changes at all?
Yeah, for me, undergrad was definitely a lot of cramming it on the last day and hoping that it all stuck. But definitely like one of the biggest things I did in undergrad that I really didn't change was like I would try to keep up with notes as much as I could. Even if I knew that I would go over it later, I would still write down notes for everything. So I'd try to take as detailed notes as I could. That way I could kind of like form pictures in my brain. And then on that last day when I did like a lot of review studying, I could remember back to those. And so that's probably the biggest thing that I've kept going forward into medical school, is just kind of taking as detailed notes as I can. I still make myself flashcards for medical school. There's a lot of programs out there that you can make flashcards for, or there's pre-made flashcards. I'm not a huge fan of the pre-made flashcards just because I'm memorizing some random fact that like I haven't seen in lecture, and I have no idea what the importance of it is except for like board exams. And so for me, those don't really work, but I know a lot of people really enjoy those. So for me, it's basically attending lecture live, because those are what our class tests come from, is basically lecture. There's a lot of outside materials that students use like religiously, but the professors know that. So they usually put a lot of extra information in the lectures that's not covered in those outside materials to make sure that you have an incentive to show up for lecture. So basically watching lecture, taking notes, and then using some outside materials and making flashcards for myself.
So, what did you do to do well in your MCAT in terms of study strategies, or what helped you do well overall?
The way that I studied for the MCAT was I used a Kaplan book, which was like a 6-book set. And I kind of did my best to like crank through them, but I honestly fell off the wagon like way earlier than I should have on keeping a daily schedule with it. So the biggest thing I would recommend is following like whatever book you use. They'll likely say things are high yield, which means that they're most likely to come up on the exams. So if you learn the high yield material first, you'll then be able to like comb through the lower yield stuff and like pick up a couple of extra points here and there. But the biggest thing that I did for studying for the MCAT was I just took as many practice exams as I could. I made free accounts everywhere that I could and took practice exams as my form of studying. It's one of those things kind of like the ACT and the SAT, where half of the battle is just taking the test. Like, regardless of the information that you know or don't know, the test itself can be like really rough. So getting yourself comfortable with taking the test and how to eliminate answers, even if you have absolutely no idea, you can look at it and kind of eliminate one or two of them. Those were my biggest test taking strategies, and the ways that I prepared was just being able to eliminate things that I knew were completely incorrect, which is hard to do if you haven't taken practice tests before.
So, is there any general tips that you would give to someone that is in the process of currently applying to medical school and going through the application process?
Mm-hmm. I would say if you're at the point of the application process, the biggest thing I would say is knock out the secondaries like as soon as you get them. If you apply in like May, your summer is definitely going to be busy getting secondary applications, because most med schools, if you meet their minimum requirements, they'll instantly send you back a secondary. So you can get like 5 of them in a day if you're unlucky on timing. So it's definitely a grind, but knocking out those secondaries as soon as you can lets the school know that they're kind of high on your priority list, and it shows them that like you care about getting a secondary application from them. So knocking those out is important. Trying to keep a balance between undergraduate life and interviews is important, because I mean, it's different now with COVID because everything's probably like online interviews, but if life ever gets back to normal, flying out for interviews can be like a big process, and it's a lot of asking your professors for like some leniency when you have to fly out. So I did 3 interviews that I had to fly for, I think. So there were a lot of times, like I had some professors who had really strict attendance policies where they were like, I don't care what your excuse is, it's still an unexcused absence. So trying to get them to understand that you can't really help it and you have to go, because med schools kind of anticipate you bending your life for them. Some schools will literally just say, you are going to be at our school on this day at this time, and we don't really have the ability to reschedule you. So balancing your life during the interview process is really important. I would also say practicing things that were passionate for you. So they'll ask you what clubs you were involved in, and it's not really important what clubs you were involved in. It's more important what clubs you had a passion for. So being able to talk about things like that. If you're in 15 clubs, you might not actually have a benefit over somebody that was in 2, but was in those 2 the entirety of undergrad and like made them and was a leader for them the entire time. So realizing what your passions are and what your priorities are throughout the interview process was very important for me. Other than that, the application process is stressful. So like being kind to yourself and not really getting down on yourself if you're not hearing back from where you wanted to hear back from. I was waiting until the very last day that I had a decision, like that I had a deadline for Toledo to hear back from another school. And they just like blew me off the entire time. So it was kind of realizing that like I had a really good offer from Toledo and I should take it. And it was kind of a big weight lifted off of my shoulders when I finally realized that and wasn't like torturing myself waiting for another school.
So, what's one thing that makes the University of Toledo specifically stand out to you as a medical school?
I would say the amount of preclinical medicine we receive. So, like I said, we do a lot of practice interviews with patients, with standardized patients. So they're employees who are like trained on how to be a patient. Like they have specific things that they say. They try to be vague, like patients sometimes are. They won't answer multiple questions at the same time. So it's like a very easy way to get experience with kind of more difficult patients in your professional life. So having all of that preclinical experience is definitely something that stands out for me. The other thing, which we haven't really gotten to experience, but they have like an insanely good simulation center. So they have like an interactive sim center that uses augmented reality and VR and stuff like that, where you can like see inside the valves of the heart and stuff like that. And then they also have very interactive sim centers where you have plastic dummies, but they'll talk to you. You can feel a heartbeat in them. Like they'll react based on what you're doing, and then there's somebody in a different room that's like controlling them and telling them what to do. So their sim center is very good, but unfortunately we haven't really gotten to get into it much. But when I was interviewing there, that was definitely something that stood out.
What do you typically do on your free time, like on the weekends, or if you have some downtime from medical school? What's there to do in Toledo?
So my biggest 2 things are I'll usually go and play soccer around because there's actually a fair few soccer fields and both indoor and outdoor. And the other thing that I do is Toledo is actually very big for volleyball, so we do a lot of outdoor volleyball. Again, I know that it kind of sucks as an answer, but if the pandemic weren't going on, they have a pretty nice downtown district that's kind of like the Flats in Cleveland. They have the zoo, which is really nice, that I've always gone to like since I was a kid. And they have a lot of national parks that are really good for hiking.
So, how did you find overall medical school different from college?
I would say the biggest difference is that there's like no unmotivated kids in medical school. Like everybody is very clearly the top of their class as undergrads or very near the top of their class. So I would say the work ethic is definitely one of the big differences. The amount of time given to specific topics is definitely different. It's much shorter without using the fire hose analogy. It's definitely a lot of information thrown at you at one time. It's not really any more difficult than anything you learned in undergrad, except for it's difficult to sort everything out and see what's important. And then I would say the other big difference is probably just how different everybody studies. Like my roommate usually like doesn't take notes during lecture. He'll listen to them, but he basically goes through flashcards, like pre-made flashcards the entire day. and watches like outside resources and like doesn't listen to lecture hardly at all, and he still does very well. Like there's so many different ways to succeed in medical school. It's kind of crazy. But I would honestly say like one of the things that surprised me was there's a lot of teachers at medical school that'll remind you of college faculty that remind you of them in like all the wrong ways. Like when we got into med school, I honestly thought it would be like the top teachers available like in the university, but it's so similar to undergrad where like there's some professors, if I know that they're lecturing, I won't even go to their lectures because I don't learn anything from them. And then there's some lecturers that are like incredible. They're all available to have office hours just like an undergrad though. So that was kind of one of the things that I was like, this is exactly the same as undergrad.
So, what does a typical day look like for you as a first year medical student?
So I would say a typical day, we usually start lecture at 8 or 9. So I usually try to get up and watch lecture live. Not everybody does that. And sometimes like if I stayed up late the night before, I'll skip lecture in the morning and then watch the recorded lecture later on because at most every school, I'm pretty sure probably every school, especially now, lecture is recorded and you literally can watch it whenever you want. So sometimes I'll watch lecture at like 9 p.m. like just to get it out of the way. But so I'll wake up, I'll get ready, I'll watch lecture, I'll note take. We usually have a meeting in the like around noon. On some days they'll like schedule us out to have a meeting. So lectures usually from like 9 till noon, and then we have a meeting at around noon to 1. Sometimes we'll have afternoon things like the preclinical medicine, different interviews and stuff like that. So that can take up afternoons. So that can be like a huge block. That could be 1 to 5 basically. And then after that, if there's an exam coming up, I'll make flashcards or go through flashcards afterwards. So after 5, I'll make dinner. And then whenever I'm done with dinner, I'll go through flashcards. I'll watch outside resources and kind of review whatever material's coming up for the exam. And then honestly, that's usually when my day ends. I'm kind of surprised how much free time I've found myself having. It's really a matter of how you thrive throughout it. Like a lot of my classmates, they cannot handle the thought of like slacking off when they have an exam coming up. But like if I knocked out everything that I needed to earlier in the day, like I usually have my evenings free. A lot of people will study the entire day every single day, and honestly I can do that, but it's not something that like I thrive at. So unless there's an exam coming up, I'll usually avoid that, and I'll have most of my evenings free.
What is one thing that you wish that you knew going into medical school that you didn't realize until you started?
I would say the biggest thing that I wish I knew was that like so long as you're getting the grades that you need, it doesn't really matter how you're studying, like obviously to a certain extent. But one of the things when I was like having my first mental breakdown in med school was basically like I was just comparing myself to everybody else. Like I saw my roommate studying every day for like 10 hours a day. And if I wasn't doing that, I thought I wasn't doing enough. But like I was doing just as well as he was in class. So it was one of those things where it was like, if it works, don't fix it. And that was something I thought that I had to fix when I came into med school.
Is there any advice that you would give to people who are in high school that are interested in becoming a doctor, like traditionally going through the 4 years of being pre-med and then through medical school?
Yeah, I would say if you know that that passion is there, stick with it. Like that was one thing that I kind of struggled with where I didn't do as well as I thought I would my freshman year of undergrad. And so like I was basically telling myself, there's no way I can go to medical school anymore. And that's just not true. Like you can have a little hiccup, especially early on. If they see improvement afterwards, that hiccup doesn't matter anymore. So I would basically say if you know that passion's there, stick with it. And Don't beat yourself up if you don't get the grades you expected. Again, to a certain point, like if you have a 2.0 GPA, obviously medical school is probably not going to work. But like when I got a B in college, like that was the end of the world to me. And it was like, now I look back on it and it's kind of silly to think about the fact that it was such a big deal to me. So if you've got that passion there, you can definitely make it through anything. Just make sure that you stay working hard, you find out that you're going in for the right reasons, and you do whatever you can to get there.
Well, lastly, to round down the interview, is there any last parting advice that you'd give to anyone who is interested in the field of healthcare, whether it's becoming a doctor, a pharmacist, a nurse, any healthcare profession in general? Do you have any advice?
Mm-hmm. I would say, like you said, there's so many different ways to get into the field of healthcare. So I would say the biggest thing is figuring out why you want to go into a specific branch of healthcare. It's one thing to know that you want to provide for people and be in the healthcare field, but there's so many different ways to do that. So it's important to realize that like you could do most of the things a doctor does as a PA or an NP. And then you can also do like a lot of the big principal stuff as a nurse, as a pharmacist. So there's so many different ways to apply yourself in the medical field. It's one thing to know that you want to practice medicine, but it's a completely different thing to know what type of medicine you want to practice and why. So sorting that out in your head and making sure you're going in for the right reasons, not saying I want to be a physician because they make the most money. That's probably my biggest piece of advice.
All right. Well, thank you, Ryan, for your time. I know you're a busy person. So thanks again for taking out your time for doing this interview. And best of luck with the next 3 years of medical school. And we'll stay in touch.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good seeing you.
All right, man. Have a good day.
Thanks. You too.